So I've been touring the Maritimes this summer, giving talks everywhere from big cities like Halifax and Moncton to small towns like Campbellton and Woodstock. And during these talks, I can get asked some distinctly unexpected questions. I was giving a talk earlier this year on Campobello Island in the Bay of Fundy when I was asked a very strange and extremely locally specific question. Was the story of the man who was hanged on the gallows he built true? I told them I'd have to look into that one and get back to them. Well, it turns out that the full story behind that strange question was even more bizarre and surreal and actually kind of funny in a dark way than even that admittedly odd question made it sound.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
Our story begins way back in the 1780s in Shelburne, Nova Scotia. This is the very end of the American Revolution, and Shelburne is basically overrun with refugees called the Loyalists. The Loyalists had fled the United States after being defeated in that war, and they'd been promised they would get free land to build new lives on. But when they got to Shelburne, everything was in chaos. Tens of thousands of people had shown up there all at once, and the very limited bureaucracy was overwhelmed. It took time to get people their land, and people were getting impatient. A group of about 100 former soldiers, under the command of Captain Nehemiah Marks, decided they didn't want to wait their turn for their official land grant, and they would just go and find some land all by themselves. This, of course, wasn't actually allowed, but no one was really going to care because they were so busy. The soldiers basically looked at a map of the Maritimes and decided to settle, sight unseen, in a little untouched patch of empty wilderness they would call Morristown in Sudbury County, Nova Scotia. Later, Sudbury County, Nova Scotia would be split off into a place called New Brunswick, and Morristown is today St. Stephen, which is right on the border with Maine. Here's a really fun fact I like about St. Stephen. Nothing to do with the story, but this is just kind of funny. St. Stephen's actually not named for the religious saint at all. It is in fact named after some local surveyor named Steve. Apparently, Steve the surveyor was in fact no saint, and his co-workers named this town after him ironically as a joke. Back to the story. Captain Nehemiah Marks and about 100 soldiers arrived at what they expected to be empty land, and they found people already there. 1 century later, in 1893, historian and author of a newspaper column called Glimpses of the Past, named W.O. Raymond, wrote a lengthy series of articles about what happened next. You might remember W.O. Raymond's name because we quoted him in the episode called The Battle of Fort Nashwauk. He was attracted to this story because, he wrote, what happened next was pretty unusual.
When Captain Marks and his colonists arrived, they found several persons settled on their spot without any claim to their lands other than occupation. Generally, in such cases, the old inhabitants were dispossessed, but these pioneers were more liberally dealt with and were willing to take the oath of allegiance, were allowed to remain, and received grants of land.
It's not really clear who these quote-unquote old inhabitants were. They could have been Passamaquoddy or Wolastoqiyik. They could have been Acadian refugees who successfully escaped the expulsion, or they could have been New England planters, which was an earlier wave of impoverished colonies from Massachusetts, who we met in the episode called Ben Franklin's Worthless Nova Scotian Land. There's examples of all three of these groups being treated rather poorly by the Loyalists. But when Captain Marks and his soldiers arrived and found them on the land they wanted to settle, they just redrew their maps of their land grants and basically just went around the people who were already there, leaving them alone and living side by side with them and basically all being friends. So we're painting a nice happy utopian picture here. Except we have one problem. one man just would not fit into this happy story of Morristown, and his name was John Dunbar. When the Loyalists redrew their land grants to go around the old inhabitants, they basically split up into different groups with their farms in little clusters instead of one big block like they'd planned. Basically, they carved themselves up to accommodate where the people were there before them. John Dunbar went to each of these little clusters of Loyalist farms, and he claimed that he was going to live there. And he got a grant for land in each of these areas. Basically, he went around sneakily collecting a whole bunch of land grants, which was not allowed. W.O. Raymond wrote,
"When this writer was a child, there was a story current that the original owner sold the lot for rum."
So John Dunbar collected a bunch of land, sold them for booze, and was often drunk and disorderly. Meanwhile, except for him, apparently the old inhabitants and the Loyalists got along pretty well. I found this absolutely fascinating, incredibly low-stakes legal battle, which offers us an interesting example of how things worked there. Often, small everyday legal problems can tell us more about how life was back then than a big famous court battle. So this one woman, who was a member of the old inhabitants, complained to the Loyalists that one Loyalist had gone into her garden and ate her peas. As I said, this is a very low-stakes court case, but the Loyalists investigated anyways. The case of who ate her garden peas. They actually found the culprit, and it turned out it was one of their fellow soldiers. So they forced their fellow soldier to pay the woman for the peas he had eaten. This may sound like a small thing, but they are being unusually sensitive for the time to these other people around them. Also, I took the peas story as a clue that these people, the unidentified old inhabitants, may have been probably Wolastoqiyik. When Samuel de Champlain was in the area much earlier, he wrote in his diary about these big, elaborate cultivated gardens and Wolastoqiyik villages in this area, and peas were a big part of what they grew. Meanwhile, as this is happening, the main character in today's story, John Dunbar, is still making a nuisance of himself, being drunk and disorderly and becoming increasingly hated by the otherwise peaceful residents of Morristown. W.O. Raymond interviewed Captain Mark's son for his article 100 years later. He wrote,
"Mr. Marks remembers being told that John Dunbar lived in the land grant next door in a log house for a year or more, and that the inhabitants were very glad when he left."
After basically being a jerk and making everyone mad at him in Morristown, John Dunbar wore out his welcome and he moved away to St. Andrews. In the context of the sparsely populated region, St. Andrews was basically the closest thing to a big city, except it was very small. John Dunbar seems to have worked as a carpenter there. At this point, a few years had passed, life is becoming a bit more settled for the Loyalists, and normal trappings of power and law are being established. St. Andrews is the center of Charlotte County, and a brand new courthouse was being built there. So the thing is, though, that when you hear the word law, you're probably picturing something really modern, which is very different from how the law worked back then. We probably got a skewed version already in this episode because of the case of the stolen peas in Morristown. In that one, the law was pretty clear. The Loyalists ate the peas and he had to pay for the peas, which makes sense, right? But Morristown wasn't actually really following the law. It was a frontier community far from the arms of the law. Basically, how the law worked back then was that if you did anything wrong, pretty much any crime at all, the punishment was death. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit by saying everything was punishable by death, but I'm not exaggerating that much. There were 220 criminal offenses on the book back then that were punishable by the death penalty. If you committed murder, the punishment was death. If you stole a sheep, death. Theft of goods worth more than a shilling, death. Shoplifting, death. Being in the company of a gypsy for more than 1 month, death. This one's a direct quote from the law books itself. Strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. Death. So with all of these death penalties on the books, what I'm saying is that this brand new courthouse in St. Andrews was going to need a gallows. Gallows are those big wooden things that they use to hang people that are being punished with the death penalty. And who built the gallows? Why, of course, it was the carpenter, John Dunbar. So it seems that John Dunbar was about as popular in St. Andrews as he was in Morristown, which is to say, not very. Basically, after completing his gallows, he continued to be a drunken mess, offended everyone, and he wore out his welcome once again, and he moved away. He and his wife, by the way, I could never find out his wife's name, they moved to Campobello Island. There was only one law officer in the region named Sheriff Paul. He wrote about what happened next.
John Dunbar was living in Campobello about the year 1798 and worked in a sawmill there. His wife had a gold coin of which he wanted to take possession in order to buy rum. Upon her refusing to give it to him, he killed her.
As you can tell from that quote, police reports were not very detailed back then. I couldn't find an original source for what happened next, but according to hundreds of years of oft-repeated folklore on Campobello Island, John Dunbar decided to dispose of his wife's body by putting it in a barrel of pork. Campobello is an island in the Bay of Fundy. The Bay of Fundy is, of course, home to the highest tides in the world. John Dunbar's logic here is that he would roll the barrel out to the water line during low tide, and then when the water rose, it would sweep the barrel containing the evidence of the murder he committed out to sea, and it would never be found again. Now, if you think about this plan for like 2 seconds, you can probably find a flaw in it. I mean, what is a barrel made out of? Wood. And what does wood do in water? It floats. So, John Dunbar does indeed roll this barrel out during low tide, and the tide duly takes it away, as was the plan. And then, as tides tend to do, it came back in, and it brought with it the floating barrel. The tide deposited this wooden barrel in the shores of basically the most heavily populated part of Campobello Island. A sealed barrel washing in from the sea is always exciting to find when you're on an island. A nice treat could have washed off a ship and might be found inside, so local people rushed out to go check out the barrel, and when they opened it, they found a nasty surprise inside. According to W.O. Raymond,
John Dunbar was arrested, taken to St. Andrews, tried, found guilty, and sentenced to be hanged.
John Dunbar was sentenced to be hung on the gallows he built the very next morning. That night, though, he escaped. Now, if you were in John Dunbar's shoes and you escape from jail, especially when you're facing the death penalty, you would probably run really fast and really far away, right? Well, as we may have established already, with his attempt to get rid of a body by sticking it in something that floats and sending it to sea, John Dunbar is perhaps not the world's smartest criminal. So he breaks out of jail, and he ran away from St. Andrews, and he fled all the way to Bayside. Bayside is approximately 7 miles away from the jail. John Dunbar found a young man in Bayside, and he asked him if he could have a job. This young man gave him a job, employing him to work in the forest that he said he owned. Turns out, though, that this young man did not, in fact, actually own the forest. It was his father who owned the forest, and his father was Captain Bradford, who had, a few years earlier, served under someone named Captain Nehemiah Marks, and had been one of 100 loyalist soldiers who had settled in Morristown with John Dunbar. According to W.O. Raymond,
The captain was away from home at the time, but on his return, when he saw Dunbar, he recognized him as the escaped prisoner. He communicated his discovery to jailer Hitchens, who came out to Bayside, arrested Dunbar, and took him back to jail.
The jailer returned John Dunbar to the prison in St. Andrews and put him back in jail, right in the same jail cell. I don't know exactly what's wrong with this particular cell, but pretty much literally the moment that he was locked into this cell, John Dunbar immediately escaped jail again. Perhaps we've established that John Dunbar is not a criminal mastermind, but even he can learn a lesson. This time, after escaping, he ran further than 7 miles. This time he fled all the way to Boston, and there he got a job as a roofer. This is a few years after the long and brutal American Revolutionary War, but it's kind of surprising how quickly a normal international relationship was established between those two countries that were recently at war. Already, if you lived in what we now call Canada, you could travel to and trade with America if you wanted. And that was exactly what this guy named Bentley did. He went from his little hometown of St. Andrews and he traveled to Boston for a business meeting. While he was there, he was walking down the street, he was taking in the sights in Boston, minding his own business, when,
as he was passing a house on a street in that city, he was struck in the head by a shingle. On looking up to see whence the shingle came, he recognized the man engaged in shingling to be Dunbar. Bentley gave information which led to Dunbar being once more arrested.
John Dunbar was again brought back to jail in St. Andrews. Actually, in a bold choice, they chose to put him right back in the same cell as he'd escaped from twice before. But this time, John Dunbar did not escape. Now, remember all the stuff I mentioned about how the death penalty was the punishment for 220 different crimes? I mean, that's all true, but back then, just like today, judges had a certain amount of leeway with sentencing decisions. And the judges in St. Andrews were quite famous back then for being soft-hearted liberals who believed that everyone deserved a second chance. In fact, they had always stayed the death penalty before the execution actually happened. With everyone, there'd actually never been a single execution in Charlotte County. This was actually a big point of pride for these judges. But even liberal Charlotte County had a limit. They decided that John Dunbar's egregious murder of his wife for rum money, plus his several jailbreaks, deserved the death penalty. W.O. Raymond wrote,
The next time he emerged from the jail was on the march to the gallows.
And it was those same gallows which John Dunbar himself had built several years earlier.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. Produced by Jordan Lozier.